Elizabeth Hensley had never once lost sleep over a firing. She had terminated over 40 employees in her 4 years as CEO of Hensley Global, and not a single one of those decisions had followed her home. That was not cruelty. That was, in her mind, the clearest sign that she was doing the job correctly. A surgeon did not weep over the tissue. She removed. She simply cut what needed to be cut and moved on to the next patient. Elizabeth believed in that principle completely, and she believed in it right up until the night she walked into Meridian Gala and found out that the man she had so cleanly cut away was, by blood and by bond, closer to her than she had ever imagined. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far our stories reach and how they resonate across the globe. Mark Lyman was not the kind of man who demanded to be noticed. He had spent 9 years at Hensley Global being exactly what a senior analyst was supposed to be: reliable, accurate, and invisible in all the ways that mattered to management. He came in early. He stayed late when the work required it. He filed every report before its deadline and never once sent anything to superiors that he had not checked at least twice. His record was, by any reasonable measure, perfect. Not nearly perfect, not mostly perfect, but actually an entirely perfect. In 9 years and 4 months, he had not missed a single day of work, not arrived late to a single meeting, and not failed to deliver a single assignment on time. This was a remarkable record, and it would have been even more remarkable if anyone at Hensley Global had taken the time to notice it. But that was the nature of consistency. It became invisible. People only looked up from a record when it was broken, and Mark's record never broke. So nobody looked up. He moved through the company quietly, did excellent work, and was paid a fair salary, and that arrangement had suited him well enough for most of those 9 years. The reason it had suited him was not because he lacked ambition. Mark was intelligent and capable, and he knew it. The reason it suited him was because his real life, the life that actually mattered to him, was at home. His real life was his daughter, Chloe, who was 8 years old and serious about school and very funny about breakfast foods, and who had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of thinking hard before she spoke. His real life was a house they shared, the dinners he cooked, the homework he helped with, the bedtime routines he had maintained without interruption since his wife Sarah died 14 months before this story truly begins. Sarah Lyman had died of ovarian cancer at 36 years old. She was diagnosed in the spring of 1 year, and she was gone by the winter of the next, which was a speed that felt both impossibly fast and unbearably slow to the people who loved her. Mark had been with her through every week of it. He had driven her to treatment, sat with her in waiting rooms, learned her medication schedule, learned how to talk to her about on the days she wanted to talk, and how to be simply and quietly present on the days she did not. He had done all of this while continuing to go to work every single day, because the bills did not stop arriving when the family was grieving, and Chloe needed stability. And Mark had decided very early in their marriage that the thing he would always be was steady. He was still being steady 14 months after Sarah's death. He was doing everything a grieving father and sole provider was supposed to do. He kept the house running. He kept his work performance immaculate. He kept Chloe's world as predictable and warm as he could manage, because he knew that children who had lost one parent needed to feel certain that they were not about to lose the other one to chaos or collapse. Mark refused to collapse. He was, in the quiet and unglamorous way that nobody writes songs about, an extraordinary man. There was one thing he had held on to since Sarah's illness, one promise he had made to himself in a hospital waiting room while filing his quarterly reports and eating a vending machine sandwich. The promise was simple. He told himself that from that point forward, whenever Chloe needed him to be present for something that mattered to her, he would be present. He would not sacrifice every moment to the job. He had already given the job more than enough. He had given the hours of countless evenings, the full attention of his best working years, and a quarterly report filed while his wife was sedated in a room behind him. The job had received what it needed. His daughter would too. This promise was the foundation of everything that was about to happen. In early October, Chloe told Mark about the school play. It was a production her class had been working on since September. A short original piece about a forest that learned to talk to humans who lived near it. Chloe had been cast as the oldest tree, which meant she had the most lines and the most responsibility, and she had been practicing those lines for weeks at the kitchen table, saying them quietly to herself while she ate her cereal and her soup and her toast. She had made her own costume with craft supplies from the art room and the help of her teacher. She was, in the way that only children can be about the things they commit to, completely serious about this play. She did not ask Mark directly if he would come. That was not how Chloe worked. She had learned, from watching her father manage a difficult year without complaining, that you did not ask people for things you were not sure they could give. But she mentioned the play often in the weeks that led up to it, and she left a permission slip on the kitchen table with the date circled, and whenever the subject came up, her eyes did something that Mark recognized immediately, because it was the same thing Sarah's eyes had done when she was hoping for something but did not quite want to say so. The play was scheduled for the afternoon of November 15th. That date, as it turned out, also happened to be the filing deadline for Hensley Global's Q4 preliminary framework. This was not a coincidence that anyone had engineered. It was simply the ordinary, grinding cruelty of a life in which important things have no awareness of each other and no interest in being convenient. Mark knew about the Q4 deadline. He had it in his calendar. He also had Chloe's play in his calendar, and he had made his decision about which one mattered more before he had even finished reading the permission slip. He was going to the play. The question was only how to manage the deadline around it, and he believed, with complete confidence and good reason, that he could do both. His portion of the Q4 framework was analytical work that he could have finished a week early if he pushed himself. He planned to have it done by noon on November 15th and leave it with his supervisor before he walked out the door. He sent the leave request to Elizabeth Hensley in October. He explained the situation plainly and professionally. He told her about the play, told her he would complete all outstanding work before he left, and offered to remain available by phone for anything urgent. He thought it was a reasonable request. He had never asked for anything in 9 years, and this was a single afternoon, and he had good reason for it. He expected, if not warmth, then at least a basic professional respect and approval. Elizabeth denied it within the hour. Her response was brief and final. She cited the Q4 deadline. She said that partial absences on deadline days were not standard practice. She said that personal commitments, however understandable, did not constitute grounds for exception. She did not acknowledge the 9 years. She did not acknowledge the loss of his wife. She did not acknowledge that the Q4 work he was responsible for would be complete before he left. She simply said no, and she said it the way she said everything. Cleanly, conclusively, and with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once found a reason to revise her position on anything. Mark read that response and felt something in him go very still. Not angry, not defeated, just still. He had worked for Elizabeth Hensley for 3 years, and he understood, with a clarity that came from paying close attention to someone for a long time, exactly what kind of person she was. She was the kind of person for whom a policy was not a guideline, but a wall. She did not see through policies to the human circumstances on the other side. She saw the policy, and she enforced the policy, and she considered that the end of the matter. He requested a meeting with her. He went to her office, and he told her, calmly and without drama, the full picture. He told her that his wife had died 14 months ago. He told her that Chloe had a speaking role in this play and had been preparing for it for weeks. He told her that he had not asked for a single accommodation in 9 years of employment, and that he was asking for one now. He told her that his portion of the Q4 work would be done before noon. Elizabeth listened to all of this. She listened the way she did everything, without visible emotion, without any sign that the words were landing anywhere that might influence her conclusion. When he finished, she told him she was sorry for his loss. Then she told him that the answer was still no, that exceptions undermined standards, and that she needed his confirmation he would be in the office. That was the moment Mark made his decision fully and finally. He had already known what he was going to do, but hearing her say those words, exceptions undermine standards, with his daughter and his dead wife and 9 years of perfect service all sitting right there in front of her and meaning nothing, confirmed it completely. He told her he would not be in the office that afternoon. He would be at the school play. She could consider that whatever she needed to consider it. He left her office and went back to his desk and kept working. Elizabeth Hensley documented Mark's intended absence that same afternoon. She labeled it gross insubordination, which was what the company policy manual called it, when an employee refused a direct instruction from a superior. She did not do this out of spite, or at least she would not have called it spite. She did it because the manual was clear and she believed in clarity. She had built her entire professional identity around the idea that a rule applied equally to everyone was a fair rule, and that fairness was, in the end, the most humane way to run an organization. She genuinely believed this. That was what made her dangerous. She did not think about Mark Lyman again for the rest of that day. She had other matters to attend to. There were 16 other employees in her direct oversight, a board presentation at the end of the month, and a client call that afternoon that ran 40 minutes longer than scheduled. Mark's situation was filed in the part of her mind where she kept decided things, and decided things required no further thought. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark completed every item on his Q4 list. He worked with the particular focused energy of someone who knows he is building toward a clear moment and wants to arrive at it with everything in order. By the morning of November 15th, his section of the preliminary framework was complete, formatted, cross-referenced, and ready for review. It was the most thorough Q4 submission he had produced in 9 years, and he produced it knowing full well what would happen after he walked out of the building. He sent it to Elizabeth at 8:30 in the morning, with a brief note confirming that everything was finished and that he would not be in the office that afternoon. He thanked her for her time. Then he finished a few smaller tasks, cleared his desk, put on his coat, and left. The school auditorium was warm and crowded with parents and grandparents and younger siblings who were too small to sit still for a full performance. Mark found a seat near the middle and waited. When Chloe came out onto the stage in her handmade tree costume, he understood immediately that this was where he was supposed to be. She stood at the center of that stage and delivered her lines with a seriousness and a confidence that made the people around Mark smile, and he watched every second of it with the kind of attention that cannot be divided or saved for later. She was good. She was really good. She had her mother's way of meaning what she said. After the play, when Chloe found him in the crowd, her face did something that Mark knew he would carry with him for a long time. It was not surprise. She had trusted that he would be there. It was more like relief, the quiet release of a child who had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally let it go. He hugged her for a long time in the middle of the crowded auditorium, with all the other families moving around them, and he did not think about Hensley Global or Q4 Frameworks or Elizabeth Hensley at all. He thought about Sarah. He thought about how much he would have loved this. He thought, in the simple and uncomplicated language of grief, that he had done the right thing. The termination email arrived at 4:17 that afternoon, while Mark and Chloe were at the kitchen table. It was concise and formal, and exactly what he had expected. Effective immediately. Gross insubordination. Severance according to the terms of his contract. Building access revoked. He was to arrange with HR to collect his personal effects. He read it twice. Then he put the phone down and looked at the table and let the weight of it settle properly over him, because he was not the kind of man who looked away from hard things. He had a mortgage. He had school fees. He had a daughter who needed stability and a life that cost money every single month. He understood all of that, and he let himself feel it. And then he made the decision, the same decision he had been making for the past 14 months in various forms, that he was going to be all right. He did not tell Chloe that night. He tucked her in and listened to her talk about the play for 20 minutes, about which parts went well and which parts went slightly wrong and what her teacher had said, and he told her she had been wonderful because she had been. Then he turned off her light and went back to the kitchen and sat alone for a while and made a list of what he needed to do. The next morning, he started doing it. What followed were 6 weeks that were harder than Mark let anyone see. He sent applications to every firm in the city that needed a senior analyst of his caliber. He took contract work from a small advisory group that paid per project and asked no questions about why he had left his last position. He managed the budget tightly and without panic, the way he managed everything, and he kept Chloe's life as normal as possible, which meant school on time, dinner on the table, homework done, bedtime kept. He told her he was between jobs and looking for something new. She accepted this with the easy practicality of a child who trusts her father completely. He went to 3 interviews. At each one, when asked why he had left Hensley Global, he told the truth. He had been terminated for attending his daughter's school play. He said it plainly and without embellishment, and watched the interviewers absorb it. One of them said nothing at all, and moved to the next question. One of them looked down at the table for a moment in a way that told Mark the interview was already over. One of them said, "I'm sorry to hear that," and meant it, and then offered him a position 2 grades below where he should have been, with a salary that was not going to cover what he needed. He turned that one down because he had run the numbers and he could not afford to take a step backward in pay just to get off the contractor list quickly. He was 6 weeks into this when his phone rang on a Wednesday morning and changed everything. Elizabeth Hensley, during those same 6 weeks, went on in exactly the same way she always had. She processed Mark's termination, hired a contractor to cover the Q4 gap, and filed the Q4 preliminary framework on deadline, which was the outcome she had predicted. The framework was filed. The deadline was met. The policy had held. In Elizabeth's accounting, this was a success. She did not frame it as a man's livelihood destroyed for an afternoon off. She framed it as a standard maintained. She did not think about Mark Lyman. She did not think about Chloe. She did not wonder whether the Q4 framework, which was reviewed and shelved within 3 months like most preliminary frameworks, had been worth what it cost. These were not questions Elizabeth had trained herself to ask, because asking would have required her to look at the human side of every decision she made, and Elizabeth had decided long ago that the human side of things was the part that made leadership weak. She would come to understand, in time, exactly how wrong that conclusion was, but she would not understand it in those 6 weeks. She would understand it later, at a gala, with a glass of champagne in her hand, and her father across the table from her, and a man she had dismissed standing between them like proof of everything she had gotten wrong. The phone call that changed Mark's life came from Thomas Hensley, and Mark did not know for the first several seconds of the conversation who Thomas Hensley was, because the name landed separately from the company name, and he was still half asleep with coffee and contract work and the particular fog of a man who has been grinding steadily without rest for 6 weeks. Then Thomas said, "Hensley Global," and Mark came fully awake. Thomas Hensley was 63 years old and was one of the most respected private investors and strategic advisors in the country. He had founded Hensley Global 23 years earlier as a small consulting firm built on what he called principled analysis, which meant doing honest work for clients even when honest work was not what clients wanted to hear. The company had grown steadily under those principles for its first 15 years. Then Thomas had stepped back from daily operations and handed increasing responsibility to Elizabeth, and the company had continued to grow under her, though in ways that Thomas found troubling when he looked closely enough. Thomas had not built his career on ruthlessness. He had built it on the belief that the best strategic advice came from people who understood that every business decision had human consequences, and that advisors who forgot those consequences eventually gave bad advice, because they were solving an incomplete version of the problem. He believed in this the way some people believe in religion. It was not an opinion he held loosely. He had heard about Mark Lyman through a former colleague who had worked at Hensley Global before Elizabeth took over, and had kept quiet, respectful track of the good people the company lost as its culture changed. When that colleague told Thomas the story of a senior analyst fired for attending his daughter's school play after 9 years of perfect attendance and the loss of his wife, Thomas had been quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then he had said he would like Mark's contact information. He called Mark not to apologize for his daughter's decision. That was not his place, and he knew it. He called because he had been planning, for several months, to build a new advisory group separate from Hensley Global, one that would operate on the original principles he had founded the company with. And he needed someone to lead the analytical work. He needed someone with deep technical skill, and also with something rarer and harder to hire for, the understanding that people are not variables in a model, but the reason the model exists at all. He had done his research before he picked up the phone. He knew Mark's work history, his output quality, his reputation among former colleagues. He knew the story of the quarterly report filed from the oncology waiting room. He knew what Mark was, and he knew that what Mark was happened to be exactly what he needed. The lunch they had downtown was one of those conversations that both men would remember afterward as unusually straightforward. Thomas told Mark what he was building and why. He told Mark what he would need from him. He told him the compensation he was prepared to offer, which was better than Hensley Global by a meaningful amount. And he told Mark, because he was a man who believed in saying important things plainly, that he admired what Mark had done on November 15th. Not the defiance of it, but the clarity of it. The certainty that some things mattered more than others, and the willingness to act on that certainty at real personal cost. Mark accepted. He accepted not out of desperation, though the timing helped, but because everything Thomas described aligned with the way Mark believed work was supposed to function. He believed that good analysis required intellectual honesty, and intellectual honesty required acknowledging that businesses existed to serve human beings, not the other way around. He had believed this throughout his time at Hensley Global and had occasionally found it in tension with Elizabeth's priorities, and he had always resolved that tension quietly and internally. Now, he was being offered the chance to work somewhere it would not be a tension at all. He started the following month. Within 3 months, he was Thomas's most trusted colleague. Within 6, clients were specifically requesting him on their accounts. The work was better than anything he had done at Hensley Global, not because it was more technically complex, but because it was conducted in an environment where the right questions were always the first questions, and the right questions were always the ones that started with people. Thomas and Mark developed a working relationship that became, over time, something closer to a real friendship. They were different men in many ways. Thomas was 63 and had the authority and ease of someone who had already won most of the arguments worth having. Mark was 41 and still carried the particular careful alertness of a man who had learned not to take stability for granted. But they understood each other in the ways that mattered, and they respected each other in a way that colleagues respect each other when both of them are genuinely good at what they do and they both know it. What Mark did not know, what he could not have known, because nobody had told him and he had no reason to look, was that Thomas was carrying something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the chain of events that was quietly assembling itself around them both. Thomas had a daughter from his first marriage. Her name had been Sarah. She had left at 19, estranged from Thomas after years of difficulty that Thomas took full and painful responsibility for, and he had not seen or spoken to her for more than a decade after that. He had spent years trying to find his way back to her, years of letters that went unanswered and phone calls that were not returned, and he had finally, 3 years before this story, tracked down where she was living through a private investigator and an old mutual acquaintance. What the investigator found was that Sarah Hensley had changed her last name when she married and was now Sarah Lyman. She had a husband named Mark and a daughter named Chloe, and she had been living quietly and contentedly in the same city as her father, without ever reaching back out to him. Thomas had sat with this information for a long time, trying to decide what to do with it, how to approach her, whether she would want to hear from him or whether another attempt would only push her further away. He had still not decided when, 2 months after finding her, he received the news that she had died. He had never spoken to her again. He had never met her husband. He had never met his granddaughter. He had lost the chance to repair any of it, and the grief of that loss was a different kind of grief than any Thomas had experienced before, because it was combined with the knowledge that he had been the one, years ago, who made repair necessary in the first place. He had hired Mark Lyman for professional reasons that were entirely genuine. But he had also hired him because Mark was a husband of his lost daughter, and because the small and grieving part Thomas Hensley that had been living alongside the large and composed part for 3 years needed to understand what Sarah's life had been. He needed to know she had been loved properly. He needed to know that Chloe was being raised well. He could not undo what he had lost, but he could be part of what remained, if the man across the table would let him. He told Mark all of this 2 months after they started working together. He told him carefully and completely, and with the full accountability of a man who had had many years to understand what his failures had cost the people around him. Mark listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, Mark was quiet for a long time. Then he told Thomas that Sarah had mentioned a difficult relationship with her father, but had never given Thomas his name. He said that Sarah had made peace with the distance in her own way, that she had not been bitter about it by the time Mark knew her, that she had built a life she loved and died in the middle of it, which was a tragedy, but also, in some part, a testament to who she was. He said that Chloe had Sarah's eyes and Sarah's way of thinking carefully before speaking. Thomas could not speak for a moment after that. He was 63 years old and had managed very difficult things with a great deal of composure for a very long time, but he could not speak for a moment then. They agreed, that day, to let things grow at whatever pace they grew. Thomas was not going to impose himself as a grandfather on a child he had never met. Mark was not going to tell Chloe anything until he understood better what he wanted to say. But they agreed that what had been lost was not going to be lost any further, and that whatever family meant in this strange and belated configuration, they were going to find out. This was the state of things when the Meridian Gala arrived. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. The Meridian Gala was the most important social event of the year in their city's business world. It was held every November in the grand ballroom of the Prescott Hotel, and it was a kind of event where people who ran things want to be seen running things, which was a slightly different activity from actually running things, but was understood by everyone present to be equally important. Elizabeth Hensley attended every year. She had spoken at 3 of them. She knew the room, knew the rhythms of the evening, knew which conversations were worth having, and which were performances staged by people who needed to be seen having them. She arrived that year in a dark green dress that was expensive and correct and said exactly what she wanted it to say, which was that she was serious without being severe. Her assistant had booked the ticket months in advance. She had reviewed the guest list on the way over in the car. She knew she wanted to speak to and roughly in what order, and she had a version of the evening mapped out in her mind the way she mapped out everything, with purpose and sequence and very little room for surprise. She had had a successful year. Revenue at Hensley Global was up. The Q4 framework had been filed on time. She had reduced operational overhead by 11% through a combination of restructuring and, in some cases, terminations that were regrettable but necessary. She was not a person who walked into a room without confidence, and that evening she had more than the usual amount. She took a glass of champagne from the first tray she passed and began to move through the crowd. She was 30 minutes into the evening and halfway through a conversation with a board member from a logistics company when she looked across the room and saw her father. Thomas Hensley was not supposed to be there. He had attended the Meridian Gala irregularly in recent years and had not confirmed this one. Elizabeth had checked the guest list. She had not seen his name. And yet there he was, seated at one of the round tables near the tall windows that overlooked the city. And he was laughing at something, a real and full laugh that Elizabeth recognized immediately as different from his polite laugh. And he was leaning across the table toward a man sitting across from him with the easy warmth that Thomas reserved for people he genuinely liked and respected. The man across the table was Mark Lyman. Elizabeth excused herself from the board member. She crossed the room. She was a woman who had trained herself over years of difficult situations not to show on her face what she was feeling in her body, and she put that training to work now as she covered the distance between herself and that table. By the time she arrived, she looked composed and curious, and only slightly more alert than usual, which was a remarkable achievement given that what she actually felt was something closer to the physical sensation of stepping off a curb she had not seen coming. She greeted her father. She greeted Mark, using his name in the same level tone she had always used with employees. She sat down when her father asked her to sit, because standing when Thomas Hensley told you to sit was not something Elizabeth did. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she had learned over a lifetime that when her father wanted her seated, it was because he had something to say, and he intended to say it at eye level. Thomas told her, without delay, that Mark had been working with him since January. He described what they had built together, the advisory group, the clients, the approach. He described Mark's contribution not as the contribution of a junior partner or an impressive hire, but as the contribution of someone who had been essential to the enterprise from the beginning. He said that Mark's work had been the difference on more than one occasion between a good outcome and a failed one. Elizabeth listened to all of this with the same careful blankness she had deployed in difficult conversations her entire career. She processed the information in the way she processed everything, factually, without allowing emotional implications to run ahead of the facts themselves. She understood that her father had hired the man she fired. She understood that he considered this man invaluable. She understood that the person she had dismissed for insubordination was now sitting at her father's side at the most important business event of the year, treated as a peer. She also understood, and this was the part that worked on her in a way she could not quite control, that Mark was looking at her the way he had looked at her in her office, steadily, without anger, without the need to make her feel anything in particular about what had happened between them. He was simply present, composed, and completely without the need for her approval, which was a quality Elizabeth had never quite known how to respond to in another person. She told her father that she was aware of the circumstances of Mark's departure from Hensley Global. She said this not as a defense, but as information, the way she stated most things. She told him that the policy had been clear, and that Mark had been given every opportunity to comply. Thomas heard this and was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he knew the full story. He said that was, in fact, exactly why he had called Mark in January. He said it with his voice steady and his eyes on his daughter, and what he did not say, not yet, was that the reason this mattered to him was not only professional. That part was coming. He had been waiting for the right moment to say it, and he had learned over 63 years that some things should not be rushed. The conversation moved through the evening in the way that difficult conversations often move, not in a straight line, but in circles that gradually close toward the center. Elizabeth told him about Hensley Global. Thomas told her about the advisory work. Mark said less than either of them and listened more, and the more he listened, the more Elizabeth was aware that he was not someone she had read simply, which had not been her experience the last time they were roomed together, when she had read him very simply indeed as an insubordinate who needed to be dealt with. She understood, sitting at that table, that she had been wrong about what she was reading. She had read his behavior, attending the play, refusing to confirm he would be in the office, through the lens of what it meant for her policy and her deadline. She had not read the person behind the behavior at all. She had never tried to. This was not a comfortable realization, and Elizabeth was not the kind of person who made herself comfortable with uncomfortable things by softening them. She held it and looked at it squarely, which was, perhaps, the first genuinely honest thing she had done in a long time in relation to another human being. Thomas, watching her across the table, recognized this. He had known his daughter for 35 years, and he knew what she looked like when something was penetrating professional shell, and he recognized it now. He decided the time had come to say the rest of it. Thomas Hensley said, first, that he had something to tell Elizabeth that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with family. He said this in a careful way of a man who has rehearsed an important conversation many times, but is aware that no rehearsal fully prepares you for the real thing. He told Elizabeth that she knew he had been married before he met her mother. She knew. It was a fact of her family history that had always been present but never examined closely. He had been married in his late 20s. There had been a daughter. The marriage had ended, and the daughter, Sarah, had been raised primarily by her mother, and Thomas had failed, in a number of ways he was not proud of, to be the father he should have been in those years. He and Sarah had grown further and further apart until she was 19 and decided she was done trying to bridge a distance that he had been the one to create. She had left. She had cut contact. And Thomas had spent the better part of a decade and a half living with the weight of that failure and trying, without success, to find a way back to her. He told Elizabeth that he had finally found Sarah 3 years ago, that she had changed her last name, that she had a husband and a daughter, and had built a life that looked, from everything Thomas could discover about it, like a genuinely good one, that he had been deciding how to approach her, carefully and slowly, terrified of making the situation worse rather than better, and that before he could reach her, she had died. Elizabeth was listening. She had the expression of someone who was processing more than they expected to be asked to process, which for Elizabeth was unusual, because she was very rarely caught with more on her plate than she had prepared for. Thomas told her Sarah's married name. He told her the name was Lyman. Elizabeth looked at Mark. Mark was looking at the table. He had known this moment was coming. Thomas had told him, 2 months into their work together, who Sarah was and what their connection meant. Mark had needed time to understand how to be in the world with that information, how to sit with the strange and painful irony of it. He had not fully resolved it. He was not sure it was the kind of thing that resolved. But he had decided, in the way he decided most things, that the truth was the truth, and the only honest thing to do with it was to let it be known. Elizabeth did not speak for a long moment. She was doing what she always did with information that required processing. She was holding it and examining it from all sides before she responded. But this time, the examination was not leading her anywhere clean or certain. There were no metrics for this. There was no framework into which this information could be filed and then acted upon according to established procedure. What the information meant when she finished examining it was this: the man she had fired was a husband of her half-sister. The little girl he had taken an afternoon off to watch perform in a school play was her niece. The loss he had described to her in her office, the wife who had died, the daughter he was raising alone, was a loss that connected directly and by blood to her own family. When she had refused his leave request and cited her policy and told him that personal emergencies were not exceptions, she had been talking about her niece's school play. She had been the exception her own family needed, and she had declined to be it. She held all of this. She held it for long enough that both Thomas and Mark simply waited, because they had both, for their own reasons, spent a great deal of time being patient with difficult things. Then Elizabeth asked Mark how old Chloe was now. He told her 8. She asked what Chloe was like. He told her. He told her about the cereal box reading and the careful thinking before speaking, and the strong opinions about breakfast foods and the seriousness about school. He told her about the tree costume and the lines Chloe had practiced for weeks, and the way she had delivered them, clearly and without fear, to an auditorium full of parents. He told her that Chloe was doing better, that grief moved at its own pace with children, and this one was moving through it with a steadiness that probably came from her father and her mother both. Elizabeth listened to this with an attention that was different from her professional attention. Her professional attention was sharp and purpose-driven, and aimed at extracting useful information. This was something older and quieter. She was listening the way a person listens when they are learning something about their own life that they did not know was missing. She told Mark that she owed him an apology. She did not dress it up or contextualize it or explain the reasoning behind her original decision, because all those things would have been ways of softening an apology until it was not really one. She said simply that she had been wrong. Not wrong about the policy, and not wrong about the deadline, but wrong about the thing that mattered more than either of those, which was the person in front of her and what he was asking for and why. She had not seen him. She had seen an attendance record and a deadline and a request that did not fit the calendar, and she had solved the calendar problem and lost the person entirely. Mark told her he appreciated that. He said it without irony and without the need to extract more from her than she was offering. He was not a man who needed his grievances performed back to him at length. He had dealt with what happened. He had moved through the hardest part of it and come out the other side into something that was genuinely better. He did not need Elizabeth's apology to make what he had been through meaningful. He needed it only in the way that honest people sometimes need the truth acknowledged, not for its own sake, but because truth unacknowledged tends to sit between people like furniture nobody is willing to move. Thomas poured wine into the 3 glasses on the table. He had ordered it sometime during the conversation, and neither Mark nor Elizabeth had noticed. He set 1 glass in front of each of them and held his own, and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said right then, and he had lived long enough to know the difference between the moments that required words and the moments that required simply being present in. Elizabeth looked at her father, and then at Mark, and thought about what it meant that this had happened this way. She thought about Sarah Hensley, who had been her sister in a technical and bloodline sense, and had lived in the same city and been entirely unknown to her. She thought about Chloe, who was 8 and serious about school, and who had her mother's eyes, and who stood on a stage in a tree costume and said her lines without fear while her father sat in the audience, having chosen her over a job that had not chosen him back. She asked Thomas, before the evening ended, what it had been like to find out about Sarah when it was too late. He told her. He told her about the investigator's report and the address he was given, and the decision process he had gone through, and the 2 months of careful deliberation that had cost him the chance he had waited 15 years to have. He told her not to make her feel guilty, but because she had asked and because he believed in answering honestly when someone asked you the hard question. He said that the lesson he had learned was that you could not manage your way to the right human decision. You could not always know all the variables in advance and make the optimal choice from a safe distance. Some things required you to stop calculating and simply do the thing that your better self already knew was right. Elizabeth nodded. She understood this not as a lecture, but as something her father was telling her about his own life, which was a different and much more useful thing. Lectures tell you what to think. A man describing his own failures, honestly and without self-pity, gives you something to carry. She carried it home that night. She turned it over on the drive back. She thought about the 40 people she had terminated in 4 years, and she thought about whether any of them had had a story like Mark's that she had not known and had not asked about, because she did not believe asking would change her decision, and had therefore decided that knowing was unnecessary. She thought about what it meant that she had been the policy and not the person for so long that she had fired her own family without recognizing them. She did not arrive at a clean conclusion that night. She was not the kind of person who arrived at clean conclusions on a short timeline, and she did not trust clean conclusions that came quickly after complicated realizations. What she arrived at was a beginning, the kind of beginning that does not announce itself or come with instructions, but is recognizable to anyone who has experienced one by the particular quality of the discomfort that accompanies it. It was a discomfort of seeing yourself clearly after a long time of looking away. She sent Mark a message the following week. It was short and professional and asked if he was willing, whether he might consider meeting for coffee so they could talk further. Not about business. She said that plainly. Just a talk. And to begin, if he was open to it. To figure out what this connection between them meant and whether there was something worth building in it. He replied the next day. He said he was willing. He said to give him a little time and to give Chloe a little more, but that he was not a man who closed doors on things before he knew what was on the other side of them. It was, Elizabeth thought, when she read that message, exactly the kind of answer Sarah would have appreciated. She did not know what had made her think that. She had never met Sarah, had never known her, had lost the chance to know her the same way she had nearly lost everything else, by not looking far enough past the surface of the immediate problem to see the person underneath it. But she felt it. She felt it the way you feel things that are true even when you cannot explain them, and she held it quietly, and she let it matter. Thomas Hensley had founded his company on the belief that the best work came from people who understood that every business decision had a human face. He had spent 23 years trying to build an institution that remembered that. He had watched parts of it forget. And now, at 63, he had found himself at the center of a story that proved his principle in a way that no model or framework or quarterly report ever could. The human face of the decisions we make does not disappear because we do not look at it. It simply waits. It waits in hospital waiting rooms and school auditoriums and barroom tables and small Wednesday morning phone calls. And sooner or later, whether we are ready or not, it turns and looks directly back at us. Mark Lyman drove home from the gala that night through streets that were quiet and lit and empty of everything except the ordinary life of the city going on around him. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Chloe asleep at home with Mrs. Petrakis watching over her. He thought about Thomas and about Elizabeth and about the strange and winding way that the truth had finally arrived at a table where all of them could hear it. He thought that Sarah, who had been brave in the specific way of people who have decided to build something good rather than spend energy on what was lost, would have found all of this interesting. She had not been a bitter woman. She had been a woman who looked at what she had and decided it was enough and then made it more than enough through the force of her own character. Chloe had that from her. Mark hoped he had given Chloe enough of the rest. He parked in front of the house. He went inside and paid Mrs. Petrakis and thanked her and walked down the hall to check on Chloe, who was asleep with her arms around a stuffed rabbit that was missing one ear, her dark, curly hair across the pillow, and her face perfectly still and completely at peace with the world. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at his daughter and thought that whatever came next, whatever this new and unexpected extension of family looked like, and however long it took to find its shape, it was a good thing. It was more than he had thought he would have, going into a year that had started with a termination email and a daughter's face in a crowd of parents, looking for him and finding him there. He turned off the hall light. He went to bed. He was, all things considered, a man who had come out on the right side of a year that had tried very hard to knock him sideways. He had not let it. He had done what he always did. He had stayed steady, stayed honest, stayed present for the people who needed him to be present, and trusted that those things, over time, would be enough. They were enough. They had always been enough. The numbers, in the end, had never been the point. Every person you manage, dismiss, or overlook carries a life far bigger than their job title. Elizabeth Hensley treated her workforce like numbers on a spreadsheet, replaceable, adjustable, and subject to deletion without consequence, and that mindset cost her more than she ever calculated. She fired a man for choosing his grieving daughter over a deadline, never once asking what kind of person he was or what he had already sacrificed for the company. She did not know that behind his attendance record was a father who had filed quarterly reports from a cancer ward, or that the little girl at the school play was her own niece, or that the man she dismissed would become her father's most trusted advisor. The lesson is simple and old and worth repeating. The way you treat people, especially when you have power over them and they have nothing left to lose, reveals exactly who you are, and the world has a quiet, unhurried way of making sure that revelation arrives at the worst possible moment. Competence without compassion is not leadership. It is just control with good numbers attached. Before you go, let me ask you something, Dot. If the story kept you listening until now, why not subscribe? A lot of people watch. A lot of people enjoy. But most never click that button. Don't just be a viewer. Be part of this. Like the video if it hit. Share it with someone who'd love it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And drop a comment telling me your favorite part of the story. I really want to know what stood out to you, though, and be honest. Do you want part 2?